Imagine if you had to size up someone as significant as Neville Chamberlain did with Hitler back in 1938. He thought he had a read on Hitler, believing he could trust him. But history showed he was way off the mark. And while most of us won't face decisions of that magnitude, we're constantly making judgments about strangers. So, in this video, we'll dive into why it's tough to gauge someone's character, and why we often trust too easily and miss lies. Trust me, by uncovering these patterns, you will definitely get better at reading people. Turns out, reading people is trickier than we think. Let's talk about Solomon, a guy who's also a bail judge in New York. His job is no walk in the park, it's serious stuff. He pores over defendants' files, sure, but he also knows the importance of looking them in the eye and having a chat. Because let's face it, a file won't tell you if someone's got that vacant, dead-eyed stare of mental instability, or if they're avoiding your gaze like it's a hot potato. So then why did Solomon and his fellow judges perform poorly when compared to machines in a test of character judgment? Well, let us help you answer that. In a study conducted by Harvard economist Sendhil Multhanam, an AI program provided with the same information as the judges suggested releasing fewer individuals who later committed crimes compared to those released by the judges. Turns out, we're all a tad too confident in our ability to read people, based on a quick glance or chat. Take psychologist Emily Pronin's experiment, where people were asked to analyze their word choices and then others. When it came to their own picks, they shrugged them off as random. But when they looked at strangers' choices, suddenly they were Sherlock Holmes, reading into every word. Pronin's findings? We're quick to judge strangers, even if we barely know a thing about them. We might think we're complex beings, but we're just as quick to size up others based on a shred of info. We can't always spot a liar just by looking. Ana Montez seemed like the perfect employee at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, but she was secretly working as a Cuban spy, passing on sensitive information. Looking back, there were signs that something wasn't right, like her reports echoing Cuban views and her behavior during crises. But of course, investigators struggled to see beyond her facade of normalcy. This highlights a common problem. We default to believing others are truthful until there's overwhelming evidence of deception. Psychologist Tim Levine conducted an experiment where people had to spot liars in videos of students being questioned about cheating. Surprisingly, even professionals like therapists, police officers, and CIA agents struggled to identify lies, only succeeding 54% of the time. The reason? We tend to believe most people are honest, needing clear signs like agitation or avoidance of eye contact to trigger disbelief. Without such cues, we're prone to assuming truthfulness. Believing in the truth is vital. Society could do better at spotting lies and deceit. Bernie Madoff, a financier, tricked many investors into giving him money with false promises of big profits. But Harry Markopolos, who investigates fraud, saw through Madoff's lies. Markopolos knew something was wrong because he grew up seeing small-time cheating. He warned the government about Madoff many times, but they didn't listen. Most people are honest in everyday life, so it's usually okay to trust them. While Markopolos did a good job catching Madoff, most of us don't need to be as suspicious all the time. It's usually safe to believe others are telling the truth, even if there are some bad people out there, like Madoff and Ana Montez. Life isn't like an episode of Friends. If you watch an episode of Friends without sound, you can still understand what's happening by reading the actors' expressions. Like when Joey is surprised, his eyes widen, and when Ross is angry, he furrows his brow. These expressions seem transparent, like they reveal the actor's true feelings. But in reality, transparency can be misleading. Imagine walking to a room after listening to a story, only to find your best friend sitting in a chair staring at you. You'd probably feel surprised, right? Well, when this scenario was tested, they found that only a small percentage of people showed the classic signs of surprise on their faces. Most didn't show any recognizable expressions at all. This reveals that our beliefs about facial expressions are often influenced by what we see in movies and TV shows, like Friends. We think we can read a stranger's face like we can read Ross's in Friends, but in reality, we might misinterpret their feelings. And this misunderstanding can have serious consequences in real life. What really matters is invisible to the eyes. On November 1st, 2007, a British student named Meredith Kircher was tragically killed by a local criminal, Rudy Guade. Surprisingly, suspicion fell first on Meredith's roommate, Amanda Knox, despite overwhelming evidence against Guade. The police believed Knox was guilty based on her behavior, like being openly affectionate with her boyfriend and speaking bluntly about the murder. But what humans don't realize is that sometimes people don't act how we expect them to, and this can lead to misunderstandings. As shown in experiments by Tim Levine, liars don't always show obvious signs, and innocent people might seem suspicious for reasons unrelated to the crime. Alcohol narrows our focus on short-term desires. Late one January night in 2015, two Swedish students stumbled upon a disturbing scene outside a Stanford University fraternity house. A man, identified as freshman Brock Turner, was seen running away from an unconscious woman on the ground. Turner had sexually assaulted her. Sadly, such encounters are not uncommon. In fact, the author also argues that sexual consent, especially between strangers, is often arguable, even before alcohol enters the equation. A survey conducted by the Washington Post revealed that many students don't have a clear grasp of what defines consent. When alcohol is involved, the situation becomes even more complicated. But then again, when it comes to dealing with alcohol-related sexual assaults on campuses, resistance is common. Although Turner's victims stress the need for men to respect women, the author suggests that cutting down on alcohol consumption and addressing consent culture are both very important steps in preventing sexual assault. In the end, being drunk affects one's ability to communicate clearly and make wise choices. Jumping to conclusions leads to terrible landings. On a summer day in 2015, Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old African-American woman, was pulled over by Texas State Trooper Brian Encina for a minor traffic violation. What should have been a routine stop quickly escalated into a tragic confrontation. Bland's irritation with Encina's aggressive actions sparked a tense confrontation, ending in her forceful arrest and later, her reported suicide while in police custody 3 days afterward. Encina's choice to pull over Bland for a small offense, using a policing method meant for high-crime zones, was wrong and uncalled for. Plus, his trust and transparency to understand Bland's motives turned out to be seriously mistaken. And in fact, Bland's anxiety wasn't a hint of wrongdoing, but rather a reaction to stress, yet Encina saw it as a danger. This tragic event highlights the risk of jumping to conclusions and misreading people's actions.